The situation in the Middle East is once again getting out of control, and despite the ceasefire agreement, the US and Iran are exchanging strikes again. Today, Bahrain announced that Iran launched a missile strike on its territory. And before that, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced an attack on another tanker in the Hormuz Strait, which, according to Tehran, violated the rules for ships transiting the strait. This happened after the US carried out an airstrike on Iranian territory in response to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' attack on a Taiwanese tanker. And all of this happened in just one day. Against this backdrop, Israel and Lebanon signed another ceasefire agreement, but less than a day later, Israel attacked Lebanese territory again in response to a provocation by Hezbollah. Overall, a number of experts are convinced that the Hormuz Strait is open only on paper, and that the memorandum between the US and Iran will be completely disrupted in the near future. And more signs indicate that Iran is deliberately trying to disrupt the agreement, after the demands put forward by the Persian Gulf countries and enshrined in the Declaration of the Council of the Arab States Commonwealth. My name is Alexei Pecci, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and don't forget to leave your comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pecci News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, no sooner had US Secretary of State Marco Rubio left the Middle East region than Iran immediately lashed out and launched new attacks in the area. Today, June 27, Iran carried out a drone strike on Bahrain, and on Saturday a ship was separately attacked in the Hormuz Strait. This was likely Tehran's response to the overnight airstrikes by the United States, and these terrorist attacks in the Persian Gulf demonstrate the danger that the war with Iran could once again spiral out of control. Even after Iran and the US reached a provisional agreement while trying to negotiate a final settlement of the conflict. In response to the Iranian drone attack on a container ship that tried to leave the Strait on Thursday, the US carried out airstrikes overnight, continuing a series of attacks that have undermined the fragile ceasefire. Meanwhile, the multinational maritime organization led by the US Navy said on Saturday that it would expand the route near Oman in the Strait of Hormuz to allow both inbound and outbound shipping. This will likely create a new flashpoint in relations with Tehran, which sees the strait as a key leverage point in ongoing negotiations with the Americans. Along with the Americans, and I should note here that Bahrain is one of the most vocal critics of Iran and is home to the US Navy's Fifth Fleet. Recently, there was a meeting there between the foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which ended with a call to stop Iranian attacks and fully open the Hormuz Strait. And these demands from the Gulf countries were a key catalyst for Iran to launch another attack, but we'll get to that a bit later. In a statement today, Bahrain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that a number of Iranian drones struck the country. The statement called the attack, quote, "an outrageous threat to the safety of citizens and residents. There has been no information yet about the causes or any damage." On Saturday, the Iranian paramilitary group, the Revolutionary Guard, issued a statement that was carried by the state news agency IRNA. It stated that the IRGC struck several targets belonging to, quote, "the terrorist US Army in the region." The statement did not specify which areas were targeted, but it was clear that it was Bahrain. The United States Central Command stated that during the overnight strikes, the military targeted Iranian missile and drone systems as well as coastal radar stations. US Vice President J.D. Vance, who led the negotiations with Iran, stated on social media Friday evening that Iran should, as he put it, pick up the phone if there are disagreements regarding the ceasefire agreement, but any violence will be met with a retaliatory strike. Well, that was a hint that if you see any problems, just call us, talk to us, and we'll sort them out without any mutual strikes. The US and Iran are negotiating the terms of the deal, including issues such as the unimpeded passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which is vital for global oil and natural gas supplies, as well as the future of Iran's stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. According to the interim agreement, the US and Iran have 60 days to agree on the details. At the same time, UK maritime trade operations reported that another tanker was attacked in the Strait on Saturday, but the crew remained unharmed. Immediately after this report, the United Maritime Information Center, operated by the US Navy, announced that the route near the coast of Oman is being expanded to ensure the entry and exit of vessels. They say that in this part of the strait, US military escorts the vessels, so it's safe there. Spoiler alert, it's not safe at all. But Iran insists that vessels must obey its orders and warns that it will start charging a fee for transit through the strait. However, in recent days, there have been more and more attempts by vessels to somehow leave the Persian Gulf. And so, Ibrahim Azizi, the head of the National Security Commission of the Iranian parliament, stated on Friday, "The Hormuz Strait is under Iran's control, so respect the rules. That was a warning. Disrespect them and we will attack you." The US and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf have rejected Iran's demands, and in general, the strait is considered an international waterway, even though it is the territorial waters of Iran and Oman. The Joint Maritime Information Center has warned that the threat to ships is significant, adding that sailors have been warned about the presence of mines and should expect the presence of US naval forces as the mine-clearing operation continues. At the same time, the International Maritime Organization under the UN on Friday suspended a new attempt to evacuate ships and stated that it will not be resumed until guarantees are received that other ships will not be attacked. Overall, according to the UN, about 115 ships have managed to leave the strait in recent days. And here it is very important to note that Iran is obviously trying to disrupt the ceasefire, since the regime in Tehran strongly disliked the demands from the Persian Gulf countries. Let me remind you, on June 25, the US and Persian Gulf countries issued a joint statement after the Cooperation Council for the Arab States met in Bahrain. I am specifically referring to Marco Rubio's meeting with the Gulf states' foreign ministers of the Persian Gulf countries. And I would like to note that it was right after this, after the published statement after this meeting, that Iran began attacking ships in the Strait. So, in the statement, the Persian Gulf countries say the following, point by point. The ministers emphasized the need to maintain unity in negotiations with Iran to achieve the common goal of preventing Iran from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons. The ministers emphasized that long-term peace requires addressing other issues as well, including Iran's ballistic missile and drone programs and proxy groups in the region. This is the point that is not included in the Memorandum of Understanding between the US and Iran, which was signed by Donald Trump. And Israel, by the way, criticized this agreement precisely for this reason. It does not address the missile program, the drone program, and proxy forces, so the Arabs insisted on this. Moving on, the ministers emphasized the importance of opening the Strait of Hormuz, but rejected any tariffs, fees, or attempts to establish control over the strait. The ministers emphasized that any trade and investment relations with Iran are conditional and can be cancelled. They depend on Iran's compliance with the provisions of the memorandum and the final agreement, as well as the cessation of its destabilizing activities, and the creation of conditions necessary for economic cooperation. The ministers agreed to continue cooperating with the Syrian government and to provide assistance in addressing key tasks such as combating terrorism, restoring basic services, improving the investment climate, and creating conditions for the voluntary return of refugees and internally displaced persons. And Syria is mentioned here for a reason. I will briefly note what the Americans and Arabs now want to hand over to Syria. The issue is about resolving the Hezbollah situation in Lebanon. That is, for the Syrians to fight against Hezbollah and essentially remove them from there, and then Israel would withdraw from Lebanon. The ministers reaffirmed their full commitment to the sovereignty, security, stability, and territorial integrity of Lebanon. In this regard, they welcomed the ongoing bilateral negotiations between Israel and Lebanon, mediated by the United States, aimed at creating conditions for a long-term peace agreement and settlement on security between the two countries. And the ministers also called for the complete disarmament of all proxy groups in Lebanon and for the restoration of the Lebanese state's monopoly on the use of force. And in response to these conclusions by the ministers of the Arab states on the same day, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran issued a warning, quote, "If any vessel attempts to pass through the strait without our permission or outside the established route, it will be responsible for all consequences." And just a few hours after that, the container ship Ever Lowly, sailing under the Singaporean flag, was attacked by Iranian drones. This attack, the first on a vessel since the signing of the agreement, was called by President Trump on Friday a foolish violation of our ceasefire agreement. In response, on Friday, the US military carried out strikes on Iranian military targets in the Hormuz Strait area. Well, as you already understood, in response to this, the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated that in response to Friday's strikes, they struck American military positions in Bahrain. In general, the pieces of the puzzle have come together. And here I would like to remind you that the ceasefire agreement stipulates that Iran, quote, "will make every effort to ensure the safe passage of commercial vessels through the Hormuz Strait, through which 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supplies pass." And ensuring unobstructed transit was Iran's main concession. But what's very important here is who and how reads these words. In Iran's interpretation, reopening the strait does not mean relinquishing control over it. The vaguely worded clause of the agreement states that Iran and Oman will cooperate on determining the future management of the waterway, effectively giving Tehran a formal role in its administration. That means Iran can now refer to a clause in the agreement signed by Donald Trump, which states that Iran does indeed have the right to establish its control over this territory in the future. While negotiations with the US continue, Thursday's strike is a signal that Iran plans to impose its own terms on the Strait of Hormuz, determining where and when ships may pass. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps condemned routes not approved by Tehran as unacceptable, extremely dangerous, and prohibited. Meanwhile, while Donald Trump assures that he has everything under control and that Iran will never control the Strait of Hormuz, the newly established Iranian Strait Authority in the Persian Gulf has issued regulations. They require ships to fill out authorization forms by email in exchange for a guarantee of safe passage, which also includes insurance. In other words, Iran has already come up with a scheme to charge for passage through the strait, hiding it behind words about risk insurance, and the risk is essentially created by the very act of charging. Exactly. So, in fact, it's insurance against themselves. Let me explain what the problem is here. In the narrow maritime corridor called the Strait of Hormuz, 3 different routes for ships have formed. And different agencies are competing to organize the transit of dozens of ships through these 3 corridors. 1. The southern route passes through the waters off the coast of Oman. This is one route. The second route, which was always used before the war, goes right through the middle of the strait in international waters. And the third route is located further north, and it is completely controlled by Iran. This puts ship operators in a difficult position, having to choose which of these 3 routes to take. If they choose the middle route, meaning the one right in the center of the strait or closer to Oman, then you might and most likely will run into an attack from Iran. Although the Americans say they guarantee the safety of passage along the coast of Oman, in reality, on Thursday, we saw an attack on a ship right in this corridor. And accordingly, this shows that unfortunately it's not completely safe there. The lack of clarity about which route to choose complicates efforts to return trade along the waterways to its pre-war level. Shipping companies say that the agreements reached by the leaders of Iran and the US, unfortunately, are not actually reflected at sea. It doesn't work, that's all they agreed on, and this is what Donald Trump is keeping silent about. If ships choose non-Iranian routes, meaning in the middle or closer to Oman, they risk being directly attacked. But if they comply with the requirements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran and use the Iranian route, they fear the risk of Western sanctions if the agreement falls through. They say that if the agreement between Iran and the US fails, then ship owners whose vessels sailed along the coast of Iran and thus agreed to Tehran's rules will simply fall under US sanctions for cooperating with the Iranians. It turns out that the carriers are the ones being held hostage. Iran initially, as you remember, demanded a fee for passage, but later stated that it would not immediately impose tariffs. Instead, it plans to charge for maritime services, introduce a new environmental fee for ships, and is also imposing its own insurance. This caused confusion among the US's Arab allies who export oil through the Strait. They wondered, what exactly did Trump achieve? In fact, the Iranians charge a fee for ships passing through. They just call it a tax, an environmental tax, payment for some unclear maritime services, insurance, and so on. Call it whatever you like, but it's really just charging a ship to pass through. As a result, after the attack on the ever-lovely ship on Thursday, the UN's International Maritime Organization completely suspended the coordinated humanitarian evacuation, under which more than 500 commercial ships with over 11,000 sailors trapped in the Persian Gulf. Well, they are supposed to be withdrawn from the region, but for now they can't be withdrawn from there. At the same time, there are huge problems regarding peace between Israel and Lebanon. Literally on Friday, Israel and Lebanon signed a framework agreement after 4 days of negotiations in Washington, which were mediated by the Trump administration. But the problem is that this is yet another peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon, but Israel has never fought with the Lebanese authorities. It has always fought with Hezbollah militants who were not at the negotiating table and accordingly did not sign anything. And less than a day later, Israel and Hezbollah exchanged strikes again. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like if you want to support Israel's work. You can do this by donating through any of the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.